Okay, so since everybody's stuck at home, we are going to try story time with Aunt Kim. So forgive me since I'm doing this via my phone. And this is my first time trying something like this. We're going to read Cinderella for the Glass Slipper. Now, Mom and Dad, this is a little bit of an older version, so it may have some points that you might not like. Please watch and read along. If you think something's inappropriate, let us know. All right. Once upon a time, there was a gentleman who married for his second wife, the proudest and most haughty woman that ever was seen. She had 2 daughters of her own, who were indeed exactly like her in all things. The gentleman also had a young daughter, of rare goodness, sweetness, and temper, which she took from her mother, who was the best creature in the world. The wedding was scarcely over when the stepmother's bad temper began to show itself. She could not bear the goodness of this young girl, because it made her own daughters appear more odious. Basically, she made her stepsisters look like a heifer. We're just going to go with heifer. The stepmother made the meanest work in the house to do. She had to scour the dishes, tables, etc., and scrub the floors and clean out the bedrooms. The poor girl had to sleep in the garret upon a wretched straw bed, while her sisters lay in fine rooms with inlaid floors upon beds, and the very newest fashion. And where they had looking glasses so large, where they had mirrors so large that they might see themselves at their full length. The poor girl bore all patiently, and dared not complain to her father, who would have scolded her if she had done so, for the wife governed him entirely. When she had done her work, she used to go into the chimney corner and sit among the cinders, hence she was called Cinderwench. So again, kids, it's just, wench is just a word, not a very nice word for girl. So, the younger sister of the 2, who was not so rude and uncivil as the elder, called her Cinderella. However, Cinderella, in spite, we're just going to turn our page, of her mean apparel, was 100 times more handsome than her sisters. Though they were richly dressed, it happened that the king's son gave a ball, and invited to it all persons of fashion. Our young misses were also invited, for they cut a very grand figure among the people of the countryside. They were highly delighted with the invitation, and wonderfully busy choosing gowns, petticoats, and headdresses, which might best become them. This made Cinderella's lot still harder, for it was she who ironed the sisters' linen and plaited their ruffles. They talked all day long of nothing but how they should be dressed. "For my part," said the elder sister, "I will wear my red velvet suit with French trimmings." "And I," said the younger sister, "shall wear my usual skirt, but then, to make amends for that, I will put on my gold-flowered mantle and my diamond stomacher, which is far from being the most ordinary one in the world." They sent for the best hairdressers they could get to make up their hair in fashionable style, and brought patches for their cheeks. Cinderella was consulted in all matters, for she had good taste. She advised them always for the best, and even offered her services to dress their hair, which they were very, very willing she should do. As she was doing this, they said to her, "Cinderella, would you not be glad to go to the ball?" "Young ladies," she said, "you only jeer at me. It's not for such that I am to go there." "You're right," they replied. "People would have laughed to see a Cinderwitch at the ball. Anyone but Cinderella would have dressed their hair awry. but she was good-natured and arranged it perfectly well. They were almost 2 days without eating, so much they were transported with joy. They broke they broke above a dozen lacings in trying to lace themselves tight that they might have fine slender shape, and they were continually at their looking glass. Basically, all they tried to make themselves look skinny, kept looking at themselves in the mirror. Mm. At last the happy day came. They went to court, and Cinderella followed them with her eyes as long as she could, and when she lost sight of them, she fell crying. Her godmother, who saw all this, saw her in tears, asked her what was the matter. I wish, I wish I wish I could. But she could not finish sobbing. Her godmother, who was a fairy, said to her, You wish you could go to the ball too. Is it not so? Alas, yes, said Cinderella, sighing. Well, said the godmother, be but a good girl. Here's our picture. Ooh, got a lot of detail in this one. How pretty. We will see that you go. Then she took her into her chamber and said to her, Run into the garden and bring me a pumpkin. Cinderella went at once to gather the finest she could get and brought it to her godmother, not being able to imagine how this pumpkin would help her go to the ball. Her godmother scooped out all the insides, leaving nothing but the rind. Then, just like if you're making a jack-o'-lantern, kids. Then she struck it with her wand, and the pumpkin was instantly turned into a fine gilded coach. She then went to look into the mouse-trap, where she found 6 mice, all alive. She ordered Cinderella to lift the trap-door, and when giving each mouse, as it went out, a little tap of her wand, it was at that moment it turned into a fine horse, and the 6 mice made a fine set of 6 horses, of a beautiful mouse-colored dapple gray. Being at a loss for a coachman, Cinderella said, I will go and see if there is not a rat in the rat trap. We may make a coachman of him. You are right, replied the godmother. Go and look. Cinderella brought the rat trap to her, and there were 3 huge rats. The fairy chose the one with the largest beard, and having touched him with her wand, he turned into a fat coachman with the finest mustache and whiskers ever seen. After that, she said to her, Go into the garden. You will find 6 lizards behind the watering pot. Bring them to me. Ooh, this one's really pretty, huh? Wow. Look at all that detail. She had no sooner done so than her godmother turned them into 6 footmen, who skipped up immediately behind the coach, with the liveries all trimmed in gold and silver. Basically, they were footmen, and they were all trimmed up in pretty coats just like everything else. The fairy then said to Cinderella, Well, you see here a carriage fit to go to the ball in. Are you pleased with it? Oh, yes, she cried, but must I go as I am in these rags? Her godmother simply touched her with her wand, and at the same moment her clothes were turned into a cloth of gold and silver, all decked with jewels. This done, she gave... Oops, sorry guys. Her a pair of the prettiest glass slippers in the whole world. Being thus attired, she got into the carriage, and her godmother commanded her, saying above all things not to stay till after midnight. Another pretty, pretty picture. My toes. And telling her at the same time that if she stayed 1 moment longer, the coach would be a pumpkin again, her horse mice, and her coachman a rat, her footmen lizards, and her clothes would become just as they were before. She promised the godmother she would not fail in leaving the ball before midnight. She drove away, scarce able to contain her joy. The king's son, who was told that a great princess whom nobody knew was come, ran out to receive her. He gave her his hand as she alighted from the coach, and led her into the hall where the company was assembled. There was at once a profound silence, Everyone left off dancing, and violins ceased to play. So attracted was everyone by the singular beauties of this unknown newcomer. Nothing was even heard but confused sounds of voices. Oh, how beautiful she is! How beautiful she is! The king himself, old as he was, could not keep his eyes off her, and told the queen under his breath that it was a longer time since he had seen so beautiful and lovely a creature. All the ladies were busy studying her clothes and her headdress so that they might have theirs made the next day after the same pattern, provided they could meet with such a fine materials and able to able hands to make them. The king's son conducted her to the seat of honor, and afterwards took her out to dance with him. She danced very gracefully, and they all admired her more and more. A fine collation was served, but the young prince ate not a morsel, so intensely was he occupied with her. She went down beside her sisters, showing them 1,000 civilities. Basically, she went and said nice things with her sisters because they didn't know who she was. Giving them, among other things, parts of an orange and citrons which the prince had regaled her. By the way, kids, oranges were like super rare then, so that was like, I don't know, giving somebody a gold bracelet. Okay, like, wow. This very much surprised them, for they had not been presented to her. Another thing, people didn't talk to people in high-class society if they had not been presented to each other. So yeah. Cinderella heard the clock strike 11:45. She at once made her adieus to the company and hastened away as fast as she could. As soon as she got home, she ran to find her godmother, and after having thanked her, she said she much wished she might go to the ball the next day, because the king's son had asked her to do so. As she was eagerly telling her godmother all that had happened at the ball, her two sisters knocked at the door. Cinderella opened it. "How long have you stayed?" she yawned, rubbing her eyes as she stretched as if she had just been awakened. She had not, however, and had any desire to sleep since she went home. "If you had been at the ball," said one of her sisters, "you would not have been tired with it. There came thither the finest of princesses, the most beautiful ever seen with mortal eyes. She showed us 1,000 civilities, and gave us oranges and citrons." Cinderella did not show any pleasure in this. Indeed, she asked them the name of the princess, but they told her they did not know it, and that the king's son was very much concerned and would give all the world to know who she was. At this, Cinderella smiling replied, "Was she ever so beautiful, so very beautiful? For how fortunate you have been! How could I not see her? Oh, dear Miss Charlotte, do lend me your yellow suit of clothes which you wear every day." "Aye, to be sure," cried Miss Charlotte. And another lovely picture, fairy godmother hiding in the background, and Cinderella trying on the glass slipper. All right, let's go. "Lend my clothes to such a dirty cinder witch as thou art? I should be let out of my mind to do so." Cinderella indeed expected such an answer, and was very glad of the refusal, for she would have been sadly troubled if her sister had lent her what she jestingly had asked for. The next day the two sisters went to the ball, and so did Cinderella, but she dressed more magnificently than before. The king's son was always by her side. His pretty speeches to her never ceased. These by no means annoyed the young lady. Indeed, she quite forgot her godmother's orders, so that she heard the clock begin to strike 12, when she thought it could not be more than 11. She rose up and fled, as nimble as a deer. The prince followed, but could not overtake her. She left behind one of her glass slippers, which the prince took up most carefully. She got home, but quite out of breath, without her carriage, and in her old clothes, having nothing left of all her finery but one of the little slippers, fellow to the one she had dropped. The guards at the palace gate were asked if they had seen a princess go out, and when they replied they had seen no one go out but a young girl, very meanly dressed, and who had more the air of a poor country girl than a young lady. The two sisters returned from the ball. Cinderella asked them if they had a pleasant time, and if the fine lady that had been there. They told her yes, but that she hurried away the moment it struck 12, and with so much haste that she dropped one of her little glass slippers, the prettiest in the world, which the king's son had taken up. They said further that he had done nothing but look at her all the time, and that most certainly he was much in love with the beautiful owner of the glass slipper. More pretty pictures. What they said was true. For a few days after the king's son caused it to be proclaimed by sound of trumpet that he would marry her whose foot this slipper would fit exactly. They began to try it on the princesses, then on the duchesses, then on all the ladies of the court, but in vain. It was brought to the two sisters, who did all they could possibly do to thrust their foot into the slipper, but they could not succeed. Cinderella saw this and knew her slipper, said to them laughing, "Let me see if it will not fit me." Her sisters burst out laughing and began to banter her. The gentleman who was sent to try the slipper looked earnestly at Cinderella, and finding her very handsome, said it would be just that she should try. And that he had orders to let every lady try it on. He obliged Cinderella to sit down, and putting the slipper on her little foot, he found that it went on very easily, and fitted her as if it had been made of wax. The astonishment of her two sisters was great, but it was still greater than when Cinderella pulled out of her pocket the other slipper and put it on her foot. Thereupon in came her godmother, who, having touched Cinderella's clothes with the wand, made them more magnificent than those she had worn before. And now her two sisters found her to be the beautiful lady who had been at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet to beg pardon for all their ill treatment of her. Cinderella took them up and embraced them, and said that she forgave them with all her heart, and begged them to love her always. She conducted the young prince, dressed as he was. He thought her more charming than ever, and a few days after married Cinderella, who was as good as she was beautiful, gave her two sisters a home in the palace, and that very same day married them to two great lords of court. And that is the end. Maybe we will do another story tomorrow. In the meantime, y'all, stay safe. I love you. Good night.